Sometimes, the most dangerous mistake is the one no one in the room realizes they've made. The chandelier light shimmered across polished marble floors as conversations blended into a soft hum of wealth and certainty. And at table 17, Jonathan Blake sat exactly where he always sat, back straight, eyes sharp, a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, his tailored navy suit flawless, his presence enough to make waiters adjust their posture and managers glance twice before approaching. Because men like him didn't just enter rooms, they shifted them, and tonight was no different, except for the quiet figure moving between tables with practiced grace, unnoticed, unremarkable, or so everyone assumed. Emily Carter carried a tray balanced perfectly in one hand, her expression calm, her steps measured, as if she moved to a rhythm no one else could hear. She didn't rush, didn't linger, didn't invite attention, and in a place where people competed to be seen, she had mastered the art of being invisible. Jonathan didn't look at her when she poured his water, didn't pause his conversation, didn't acknowledge the presence of someone he had already categorized as background, because across from him sat a man worth listening to, a potential partner, a deal that could reshape an entire sector, their voices low, controlled, deliberate, and then it shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. Jonathan leaned back slightly and changed languages, the cadence different now, the words unfamiliar to anyone within earshot, a calculated move, one he'd used before. Because privacy wasn't just about silence, it was about exclusion, and this language, rare, precise, was his way of ensuring control, his way of deciding who got to understand and who didn't. The man across from him responded cautiously, clearly not as fluent, but willing to follow, willing to trust, because men trusted Jonathan Blake. They trusted his certainty, his reputation, his history of being right, always right. And around them, the restaurant continued as if nothing had changed. Glasses clinked, forks met porcelain, a quiet orchestra of normalcy. But a few feet away, Emily slowed, not enough to be noticed, just enough to listen. Her eyes flickered once, a subtle shift, like a page turning in a book no one else could read. She set down a plate at the neighboring table, her movements still smooth, still controlled. But something had changed, something internal, something precise. She didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't betray what she understood, because people like her didn't rush into moments. They waited for the exact second that mattered. And Jonathan continued, confident, explaining a clause, his tone steady, authoritative, outlining terms that sounded complex even in a language most couldn't identify. The other man nodded, slower now, uncertain but trying to keep pace. And then, just as Emily turned to leave, just as the moment seemed complete, she stopped, only for a second, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table. Her voice when it came was soft, almost lost beneath the ambient noise, but clear enough for him to hear. That clause doesn't mean what you think it means. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The world held its breath without knowing why. And then Jonathan Blake stood up, abruptly, his chair scraping against marble, his eyes no longer distant, no longer indifferent, but focused, locked onto her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, not as background, but as something else entirely, something unexpected, something impossible. And in that silence, the kind that doesn't come from quiet but from realization, everything in the room shifted. The sound of the chair against marble lingered longer than it should have, a sharp line cutting through the quiet rhythm of the room. And for the first time that evening, every nearby conversation slowed, not stopping completely, but bending just enough to notice that something had shifted. Jonathan Blake did not speak immediately, which in itself was unusual, because men like him always had the next word ready, always controlled the pace. But now his gaze was fixed, unwavering, studying the woman in front of him as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood. Emily did not step back, did not apologize, did not fill the silence with explanations. She simply stood there, tray still balanced in her hand, posture straight, eyes steady, as if she had not just interrupted a conversation that could move millions of dollars, as if she had merely corrected the temperature of a coffee. Jonathan's partner glanced between them, confusion written across his face, waiting for someone to restore order, but Jonathan did not look away from her. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice lower now, not louder, not angry, just precise, the kind of tone that demanded accuracy. Emily tilted her head slightly, not submissive, not defiant, just certain. "The clause you referenced," she said, her voice calm, measured. "In this context, it does not imply exclusivity. It implies conditional transfer depending on regional compliance standards." The words landed softly, but their weight was unmistakable, and across the table, the other man stiffened, his earlier confidence faltering as he processed the implication. Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because he knew that tone, he knew that level of specificity. That was not guesswork, that was not luck, that was understanding, deep and exact, the kind that could not be faked. "That is not how it was translated," the partner said quickly, his voice carrying a hint of urgency now, and Emily's eyes shifted to him for the first time, not dismissive, not challenging, just clear. "Then it was translated incorrectly," she replied, and the simplicity of the statement made it impossible to argue without exposing uncertainty. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his mind already moving, replaying the conversation, the wording, the structure. He switched back to the original language, repeating the clause aloud, this time more carefully, dissecting it. And the moment stretched, seconds feeling longer, heavier, until finally he stopped. And the silence that followed was different now, no longer confusion, but realization. He looked back at her. Something in his expression changed, something subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that only happened when certainty cracked. "How do you know that?" he asked, and for the first time, it was not a test, it was a question, real and unguarded. Emily did not rush to answer. She set the tray down gently on the nearest surface, the soft clink of porcelain grounding the moment. "Because that clause was rewritten 3 years ago," she said, her voice still even. "After a compliance issue in Southeast Asia forced a revision in how conditional transfers are defined." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Because now the room, the deal, the man across from him, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a single, unavoidable thought. This was not a coincidence, and standing in front of him was not just a waitress who overheard something, but someone who understood something he almost missed. And in that quiet realization, the balance of the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Jonathan did not sit back down, not yet, because something in him resisted returning to the version of the moment that existed just seconds ago, the version where he was in control, where every word carried certainty. Instead, he remained standing, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, grounding himself in a reality that had just shifted beneath his feet. His partner cleared his throat, a small, uncomfortable sound. "Perhaps we should review the documentation again," he said, attempting to regain structure. But his voice lacked the confidence it held earlier, and Jonathan did not respond to him immediately, his attention still fixed on Emily. 3 years ago," he repeated, slower now, testing the timeline. "That revision was internal, not widely published." Emily nodded once, a small movement, precise. "It was circulated through a limited compliance brief," she said. "Most people overlooked it because the wording change seemed minor." Jonathan's eyes flickered, not with doubt, but with recognition, because he remembered that brief, barely, a late night, a stack of documents, something he had skimmed, trusted his team to handle, trusted the system to absorb, and now that small oversight stood in front of him in human form, calm, composed, undeniable. "You are not most people," he said, and it was not a compliment, not yet, it was an observation. Emily did not smile, did not react. She simply met his gaze. "No," she said quietly, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. The restaurant continued around them, but at their table, time seemed to narrow, focus sharpening into something almost surgical. Jonathan finally pulled out his chair and sat down, but not in the same way as before, not with casual authority. This time it was deliberate, controlled, as if he were stepping into a different role. "Repeat the clause," he said to his partner, switching again into the original language. And this time, when the words were spoken, Jonathan listened differently, not for confirmation, but for truth, his mind dissecting each phrase, each implication, and beside him, Emily remained still, not interrupting, not guiding, allowing him to arrive at the conclusion himself, because real understanding could not be handed over. It had to be recognized, and when he reached the end of the sentence, he stopped. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was definitive. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, a quiet release. It changes the structure of the entire agreement, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The partner's expression tightened, calculations replacing confidence, and for the first time that evening, Jonathan's focus shifted away from the deal, away from the numbers, back to the person who had altered the trajectory of both. Emily, he said, reading her name from the small tag pinned neatly to her uniform. The first time he had acknowledged it. Where did you learn this? The question hung in the air, not as an interrogation, but as an opening, an invitation to reveal something beyond the surface. Emily reached for the tray again, lifting it with the same steady balance, her posture unchanged, her presence still quiet, but no longer invisible. In places where details matter more than titles, she replied, and there was no arrogance in her tone, no attempt to impress, just a simple statement of fact. Jonathan studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but meaningful. Stay, he said, not as a command, but as a request. And for a man like him, that difference meant everything. Emily paused, just briefly, then inclined her head once, setting the tray back down, and in that small decision, the dynamic of the table shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because now she was not just serving the conversation, she was part of it. The shift was subtle, but everyone at the table felt it. Even if they could not name it, the balance had moved, not in volume, not in status, but in gravity. And Jonathan Blake, a man who built his life on controlling outcomes, recognized that something here could not be controlled the usual way. He leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced, his attention no longer divided between the deal and the room. Now it was singular, focused entirely on the quiet woman standing beside him. If the clause changes the structure, he said slowly, then the risk shifts to regional liability. His partner hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. That would require a different compliance framework, he admitted, and the words sounded heavier now, less certain. Jonathan glanced at Emily, not for permission, not for validation, but for alignment. And the timeline, he continued, it extends beyond the projected quarter. Emily did not rush to answer. She simply met his gaze. If interpreted correctly, yes, she said, her voice steady, but only if the implementation follows the revised standard. Otherwise, the agreement becomes void in specific jurisdictions. The precision of her response landed with quiet authority, not overwhelming, but undeniable. Jonathan sat back slightly, processing, recalculating, the numbers in his mind adjusting in real time, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, not uncertainty, but interruption, a break in the seamless flow of his decision-making, and it did not frustrate him. It intrigued him. Across the table, his partner shifted in his seat, no longer leading the conversation, now following it. We can revisit the draft, the man said, attempting to regain footing. But the tone had changed. The momentum was no longer his to steer. Jonathan raised a hand slightly, not dismissive, but decisive. We will, he said, but not tonight. The statement was calm, final, and the deal that had seemed inevitable just minutes ago quietly dissolved into something unfinished, something postponed. The partner forced a polite nod, masking disappointment with professionalism, and Jonathan turned back to Emily, studying her with a level of attention that few people ever received. You saw all of that from one sentence, he said, and it was not disbelief, it was assessment. Emily shook her head lightly. Not from one sentence, she replied, from what was missing around it. The answer lingered, because it revealed more than knowledge. It revealed perspective, the kind that looked beyond what was said and into what was assumed. Jonathan's lips pressed into a faint line, something close to a smile, but not quite. Recognition without amusement. Most people listen to confirm what they already believe, he said, almost to himself. Emily nodded once. And miss what changes everything, she added. And the simplicity of it settled into the space between them. Not as a challenge, but as truth. A waiter from another section approached hesitantly. unsure whether to interrupt. "Sir, your main course," he said, placing the plate carefully on the table. The aroma of a perfectly prepared steak rising briefly into the air, but Jonathan did not look at it, did not reach for his utensils. His focus remained where it had shifted, and the rest of the room began to move again, conversations resuming, glasses lifting, the world continuing as if nothing had happened. But at table 17, something quiet and irreversible. Jonathan picked up his glass of water, took a small sip, then set it down with deliberate care. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, the one his partner had just vacated. The word was simple, but its meaning was not, because this was not about service anymore. This was about presence, about recognition, about inviting someone from the background into the center of the frame. Emily looked at the chair, then back at him, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, but her eyes held something deeper now, something that acknowledged the moment without being defined by it. And after a brief pause, she moved, not hurried, not hesitant, simply certain. And as she took the seat, the distance between them disappeared, not physically, but in something far more significant, the difference between being overlooked and being seen. She did not sit like someone who had just been invited into a billionaire's conversation. She sat like someone who had always belonged in rooms where decisions carried weight, her posture relaxed but precise, her hands resting lightly on the table, not claiming space, not shrinking from it either. And Jonathan noticed that immediately, because he had spent years observing people in moments like this, watching how they reacted to proximity, to power, to opportunity. Most leaned forward too quickly, spoke too much, tried to prove something. But Emily did none of that. She simply existed in the moment, steady, unforced, and that unsettled him in a way he could not quite define. He studied her for a second longer before speaking again. "You said the clause was revised after a compliance issue," he began, his tone now analytical, not testing, not dismissive, but engaged. "What issue?" Emily glanced briefly at the glass in front of her, untouched, then back at him. "A regional dispute involving transfer rights," she said. The original wording allowed too much flexibility, which created a loophole, one that cost a company nearly $180 million in penalties. The number landed quietly, but its implication echoed. Jonathan's expression did not change dramatically, but something behind his eyes sharpened, because that number was not abstract to him. It was real, it was measurable. It was the kind of loss he had built his entire career avoiding. "And the revision closed that gap," he said, more statement than question. Emily nodded once. "It redefined the conditions so that ambiguity could not be used as leverage." Jonathan leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table, a habit he rarely allowed himself in front of others. But this was different. This was not performance. This was thought. "Then tonight," he said slowly, "I was about to agree to a structure that reopens that risk." Emily did not correct him, did not soften it. She simply held his gaze, and that was enough. Across the room, a few heads turned subtly, not because they heard the words, but because they felt the shift, the way attention had condensed around a single table, the way a conversation had become something more than business. Jonathan reached for the folder in front of him, flipping it open with controlled precision, scanning the printed terms, and for the first time, he was not reading to confirm. He was reading to question, to challenge, to see what he had missed. And beside him, Emily remained quiet, not guiding, not interrupting, allowing him to navigate the realization on his own, because she understood something most people did not, that the strongest kind of influence did not need to be loud. It only needed to be right. "Why are you here?" Jonathan asked suddenly, without looking up from the document. The question was not about the restaurant. "Not really." Emily's answer came without hesitation. "Because it pays the bills," she said. Simple, direct, but incomplete. Jonathan closed the folder slowly, lifting his eyes to meet hers again. "That is not what I meant," he said. And this time there was something beneath the words, not suspicion, not accusation, but curiosity, genuine and unguarded. Emily held his gaze for a moment, then allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch the corner of her lips. Not playful, not defensive, just aware. "I know," she said, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was layered, filled with everything unsaid, everything he was beginning to understand but could not yet fully articulate. And in that quiet space, Jonathan Blake realized something that no contract, no deal, no negotiation had ever forced him to confront before. That the most valuable insight in the room had not come from the man across the table or the documents in his hands, but from the person he had not even noticed 5 minutes ago. Jonathan did not look away this time, not when she gave an answer that was both true and incomplete, because he recognized that kind of answer. He had given it himself more times than he could count, statements that satisfied the surface but guarded the depth beneath. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself on the receiving end of that restraint. "You read compliance briefs most executives ignore," he said, his voice quieter now, not probing for weakness, but tracing for pattern. "You understand regional frameworks, contract language, risk exposure, and you notice what is missing, not just what is written." He paused, just long enough for the weight of the observation to settle. People do not learn that by accident. Emily did not respond immediately, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the table as if grounding herself in the present moment. The restaurant noise continued around them, distant now, almost irrelevant. "No," she said finally, "they do not." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer hidden behind formality. "So again," he said, "why are you here?" This time the question carried something different, not curiosity alone, but respect, because he was no longer asking who she was beneath the uniform. He was acknowledging that there was something worth uncovering. Emily's gaze softened just a fraction, not with vulnerability, but with clarity, as if deciding how much truth this moment could hold. "Because sometimes," she said slowly, "being unnoticed gives you time to understand things that people in the spotlight never see." Jonathan's brow lowered slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. Because the answer did not deflect, it redirected. It revealed a perspective rather than a history, and that intrigued him more than any resume ever could. He leaned back again, exhaling quietly, processing not just her words, but the implications behind them. The idea that insight could grow in silence, that clarity could come from distance rather than authority. It challenged something fundamental in the way he had always operated. Across from them, the empty chair where his partner had been now felt symbolic, a space that had been filled with certainty, now replaced with something far more unpredictable. Jonathan glanced at the untouched plate in front of him, then pushed it slightly aside, not out of disinterest in the meal, but because his focus had shifted entirely. 3 years ago, he said, returning to the thread that connected everything. "That revision you mentioned, the compliance issue, the loss, it was not widely publicized." Emily nodded. "It was not meant to be," she replied, "but it was studied closely by the people who needed to understand it." Jonathan's eyes held hers, steady, unwavering. "Were you one of those people?" he asked, and the question was simple, but the answer carried weight. Emily did not look away, did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, and for a moment, the words seemed to expand in the space between them, not dramatic, not emphasized, just certain. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to believe. "Then you did not just read about the mistake," he said. "You learned from it." Emily's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet depth in her eyes now, something that suggested experience rather than observation. "Some mistakes are too expensive to ignore," she said, and the way she said it hinted that the cost had not only been financial. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, and in that silence, he realized that whatever path had brought her here was not simple, not accidental, and certainly not ordinary. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, understated business card, placing it on the table between them, not sliding it across immediately, not forcing the gesture, just setting it there. "If you ever decide," he said carefully, choosing each word with intention, "that being unnoticed is no longer where you belong." He paused, meeting her gaze fully. "Call me." The offer was not framed as opportunity, not as charity, but as recognition, and Emily looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, thoughtful, composed, as if weighing something beyond the obvious. And in that quiet exchange, something passed between them, not agreement, not expectation, but understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be real. Emily did not reach for the card immediately, and that small pause said more than any immediate reaction could have, because most people in her position would have taken it without thinking, would have seen it as a door, an escape, a sudden shift in trajectory. But she simply looked at it, as if measuring its weight, not an opportunity, but in consequence. Jonathan noticed that. Of course he did, because hesitation in the face of advantage was rare, and rarity always drew his attention. "You are not surprised," he said quietly, not as a challenge, but as an observation. Emily's gaze remained on the card for a moment longer before she lifted her eyes back to his. "I am," she replied, her tone even. "Just not for the reason you think." Jonathan leaned slightly forward again, resting his forearms on the table, fully engaged now. "Then tell me the reason," he said, and there was no impatience in his voice, only interest, genuine and undiluted. Emily exhaled softly, a breath so subtle it barely moved her shoulders. "Most people notice too late," she said, "after the mistake has already cost them something." She paused, just briefly. "You noticed before it happened." Jonathan's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a deeper focus, because that was not praise, it was recognition of a different kind, one that placed him not above the situation, but within it, accountable, aware, and for a moment, he said nothing, letting the words settle, letting the meaning unfold. "That is what impressed you," he said finally, and Emily gave a small nod. "It is what made me speak," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried a quiet honesty. She had not spoken to prove anything, not to reveal herself, not to gain attention. She had spoken because the moment required it, because the cost of silence would have been too high. Jonathan glanced at the card again, still resting between them, untouched, then back at her. "And now," he said, "you are deciding whether to remain unnoticed." Emily's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement. "I am deciding whether being seen changes anything that matters," she said, and that answer lingered longer than the others, because it reframed the entire moment. This was not about opportunity, not about status, it was about alignment, about whether stepping into visibility would serve the same purpose as staying outside of it. Jonathan considered that, truly considered it, which was something he did not often do when it came to people. He usually assessed, decided, moved forward. But this was different. This required something slower, something more deliberate. "It changes the scale," he said after a moment. "The impact of what you see, what you understand, it reaches further." Emily held his gaze, steady, thoughtful. "Scale is not always the same as meaning," she replied, and the quiet certainty in her voice made the statement land without resistance. Jonathan let out a soft breath, almost a quiet laugh, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because he understood that distinction more than most. He had spent years increasing scale, expanding influence, building reach, and yet meaning had never followed as easily as numbers did. He picked up the card, this time sliding it gently toward her, not insistently, not expectantly, just placing it within her reach. "Keep it," he said, not as a decision, just as a possibility. Emily looked at the card again, then slowly, deliberately, picked it up, her fingers light against its surface, as if acknowledging its presence without committing to its promise. She turned it once in her hand, reading the name, the number, then slipped it into the small pocket of her apron. The movement simple, almost unremarkable, but final in its own quiet way. And when she looked back at him, nothing in her posture had changed, nothing in her expression had shifted. She was still the same calm, composed presence she had been from the beginning, and yet the space between them felt different, not because of what had been offered, but because of what had been understood, and in that quiet understanding, neither of them needed to say anything more to know that this moment would not end when the conversation did. The moment did not end with a dramatic shift, no sudden applause, no visible acknowledgement from the rest of the room, just the quiet return of movement, of conversations resuming, of glasses lifting and plates being cleared. But at table 17, something had settled into place, something subtle and irreversible. Jonathan Blake reached for his utensils at last, cutting into the steak that had long since cooled. But even as he took a bite, his attention was not on the meal. It was on the conversation that had reshaped the evening. Across from him, Emily sat for a few seconds longer, not lingering out of hesitation, but out of completeness, as if the moment needed no extension, only recognition, and then she stood, smooth, unhurried, returning to the role she had never fully left. But now it was different, not diminished, not hidden, simply chosen. She picked up her tray, her movements once again blending into the rhythm of the restaurant. But this time, when she moved between tables, there was a quiet awareness in her steps, not of being watched, but of being seen. Jonathan followed her with his eyes for a brief moment, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, just enough to register the way she carried herself. The same calm precision, the same absence of unnecessary motion, but now layered with something else, something he could not quite define, and that unsettled him more than any miscalculation ever had, because it meant there were still variables he did not fully understand. He set his fork down, his appetite replaced by thought, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sit in that space, not solving, not deciding, just observing. A manager approached cautiously, sensing the shift without knowing its cause. "Mr. Blake, is everything to your satisfaction?" he asked, his tone carefully professional. Jonathan glanced at him briefly, then back at the room. "Yes," he said simply, and then after a pause, "It is," and the second sentence carried a different weight, one the manager could not interpret, but felt nonetheless. Across the floor, Emily paused at another table, taking an order, her voice soft, her presence unobtrusive, and yet, something about the way she listened, the way she held space for the words being spoken, made the interaction feel more deliberate, more grounded, as if even the smallest exchanges carried meaning when given the right attention. Jonathan watched that for a moment, then looked away, not because it no longer mattered, but because it mattered enough to let it remain undisturbed. He reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip of water, and in that simple action, he felt the echo of her earlier words, about what was missing, about what most people overlooked, and he realized that this was not just about a clause, or a contract, or a potential loss avoided. It was about perspective, about the ability to see beyond the surface of things, to notice the gaps, the quiet inconsistencies that others ignored. And that realization stayed with him as the evening moved forward, as the bill was placed discreetly on the table, as he signed it without hesitation, leaving a tip that far exceeded expectation, not as a gesture of generosity, but as acknowledgement. He stood, adjusting his jacket with the same composed efficiency he had arrived with. But something in his posture had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough. As if the weight he carried was now balanced differently. He glanced once more toward the floor, toward the movement of staff and guests and quiet exchanges, and though he did not search for her, he knew she was there, somewhere within that rhythm, and that was enough. Because some encounters did not need to be repeated to remain significant. They simply needed to be understood, and as he turned to leave, stepping out into the cool night air beyond the glass doors, Jonathan Blake carried with him something far more valuable than the deal he had walked away from. He carried the awareness that the most important voice in the room is often the one no one thinks to listen to, until it is too late. The night air was cooler than he expected, a quiet contrast to the warmth and controlled elegance of the restaurant behind him. And as the glass doors closed softly, sealing off the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware, Jonathan Blake paused for a moment on the sidewalk, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because something about the evening refused to settle into the usual pattern of completion. There was no clean ending, no clear resolution, just a shift that continued to echo, subtle but persistent. He adjusted his cuff slightly, a habitual gesture, precise, composed, and yet his mind was not on the next meeting, not on the next deal, not even on the numbers he had just walked away from. Instead, it circled back to a single sentence, delivered without force, without intent to impress, and yet powerful enough to stop him mid-thought, mid-decision, mid-certainty. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fade into the night, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to acknowledge something he had long ignored, that control was not the same as clarity, and certainty was not the same as truth. Inside, the restaurant continued as it always did, a seamless flow of service and expectation, and Emily Carter moved through it once more, her presence returning to its quiet rhythm. She refilled glasses, noted orders, offered small, polite acknowledgments that carried no excess, no performance. And yet, within her, something had also shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that changed her outward behavior, but in a way that deepened her stillness. Because moments like that did not elevate her. They confirmed her, confirmed that what she saw, what she understood, had value beyond the roles people assigned to her. She passed by table 17 again, now cleared, reset, ready for the next guest, and for a brief second, her fingers brushed the edge of the table, not out of sentiment, but recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of a moment that had already become part of something larger. She did not linger, did not look back, because she did not need to. She had never relied on moments to define her, only to reveal what was already there, across the room. The manager watched her for a second longer than usual, not fully understanding why, only sensing that something about her presence carried more weight than before. But he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and that was the nature of it, the most significant. Changes rarely announced themselves, they simply existed, unfolding quietly beneath the surface. Jonathan stepped toward the waiting car at the curb, the driver opening the door with practiced timing. But before getting in, he paused again, just briefly, his gaze lifting toward the city lights stretching beyond the street. And in that moment, he made no dramatic decision, no immediate call, no sudden change in direction. Instead, he carried forward something far more lasting, a recalibration, a subtle but undeniable shift in how he would listen, how he would look, how he would question the spaces between what was said and what was assumed. Because he understood now that the difference between a costly mistake and a quiet correction could come down to a single voice, one that did not raise itself above the noise, but waited, precise and patient, until the exact moment it mattered. And back inside, Emily moved on to the next table, the next interaction, the next quiet exchange, her expression calm, her presence steady, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And perhaps that was the truth of it, because for her, it was never about being seen. It was about seeing clearly, and in a world that often mistook volume for value. That clarity was its own kind of power, one that did not need recognition to exist, only the right moment to be heard. And sometimes, just one sentence was enough to change everything.